Awesome. So thank you all for being here. It's 5 o'clock. It's day 2 of the conference. I know you're tired, probably by now. There's a ton of information, so I really appreciate you all being here. And I'll try to do my best to get you folks on time a little bit earlier so that you have time to relax before the attendee party. A little bit of background about myself. My name is Hamid Mahmood, and I'm a program manager on the Windows 8 team working on the developer experience component. I've been associated with XAML for quite some time now. I started off working as a developer on the Windows Presentation Foundation team, or WPF, and that's where XAML was first introduced. And then later on, I worked on Silverlight as a program manager, working mostly on data and data binding. And over the past however long, it's been really fun working on XAML for Windows 8, and I've focused mostly on controls and control model. So today's session is mostly going to be around controls. Just a call out here that I'm assuming that a level of XAML knowledge in the audience. So just show of hands, who here is new to XAML? A few people. Awesome. So for you, in my first demo, I will go over some of the basics real quick, but there are tons of information out there on the web for you to get up to speed. So between yesterday and today, you've been to the keynotes, you've been to the big picture sessions, and you've seen what Windows 8 user experience and the Windows 8 promise is all about. And today, there was a session in the morning around XAML and what's new in XAML, and that session got you started with building applications for Windows 8 in XAML. And then Marco Matos had an application model and contract session that really got you up to speed around how to build these immersive applications using XAML. So the next step here is, how do I make my UI look good? How do I make my collections and data collections look good? So in this session, you will learn how to build data experiences in your Metro-style applications. To that end, first of all, we will start off by understanding and taking a look at the user experience around data collections in Windows 8 and what's new about it. Then we will go ahead and look at some of the new XAML collection controls. What are the capabilities? And we'll also go in a little bit of detail on how to use them. And finally, we'll look at some of the advanced scenarios around that really let you provide a simpler and easier user experience for your end users. And we'll go over that, and it will become clearer what I'm talking about. So I'm going to start off by saying the obvious. Collections are everywhere. We are so used to them that sometimes we don't even think about data in terms of collections. There are collections of photos that you're really familiar with. There are tons of websites, tons of applications around there. Collections of files in the file system. Now, this was kind of new to me because it's always collections, but I never thought of file system as a collection. Then there's collections of news articles that you probably read daily. Then the collection of Twitter feeds that yesterday was going really berserk with all the built-in hashtags. Collections of alarms and an alarm clock app, and then finally collections of applications, which is part of your Windows 8 shell. So establishing the fact that collections are used widely and they are all around us. So in Windows 8, collections have a unique, exciting personality. And what do I mean by that? They support touch as a first-class citizen, along with supporting mouse and keyboard. They're designed for touch. They provide fast and fluid panning with inertia. They support the Windows 8 touch language. And they really provide fluid animations for user interactions that really help bring your applications to life. And just belaboring on it a little bit, yesterday we talked about tiles and how an active tile really brings your applications to life. And Alesh, in his keynote, also mentioned how a collection which does not do animations is crap. And I thought that was really cool for him to call that out. So in Windows 8, collections actually, animations are part of the collections personality. So let's take a look at, a quick look at the Windows 8 experience around collections. All right, so here's the PickStream application. And this is part of the early developer preview bits that you've gotten. And I've loaded this up already. And over here, I have a collection of images. And you can see that as I pan, this pans smoothly all the way across. And you can see how fluidly and smoothly it pans across the board. It works. I can go ahead and select items in here using touch. It keeps on working with the mouse. As you can see, I can go ahead and mouse around. The scroll bar keeps on working with the mouse. And if I had a keyboard hooked up here, you could see that keyboard navigation in, between items of this collection also works really well. So this is a complete story around all the devices, touch, keyboard, and mouse with fast animations. Looking at another example, which is the Memories app, and it's been up for a while. All right, so, and some of this, who went to John Papa's session right before this? There are a few people, so some of this might be familiar to you. And who all went to Joe Stegman's session in the morning? All right, so there are a lot of people who haven't been to either of the sessions, so that's good. So over here, I have a collection of images. And I'll go to the edit mode and really quickly show how I can reorder some of the pages in this album. And if I want to move this item, I'll just drag it around with the finger, see how it moves with my finger fluidly. And then if you notice, these other items move out of the way to indicate where the item that I'm dragging will drop. And if I drop that, notice the animations around all the elements that are being moved. And this actually animates really smoothly and very subtle animations that really gives a feeling that your application is alive. So notice this, as I'm going to delete this image, all of the items animate to their new slot. All right, let me get back to my slides. So as you see that, the personality of Windows 8 shows in collection experiences as well. The features that we talked about, animations, panning, touch support, the Windows touch gesture support, all of that comes built in with your out-of-the-box collection controls. So when you are building your Metro-style applications using XAML, I'd encourage you to use the built-in controls because it first of all, provides you a fast and easy way of providing the Windows 8 experience in your applications. Hence, you can focus more on building in the contracts and doing the right thing with process lifetime management and spend your time there. So here's a list of the new XAML collection controls that we have in Windows 8. I'm going to go through this real quick on this slide. So we have list view and grid view. Those are two list controls. We have support for grouping inside grid view. Then we have something called the semantic zoom, which I'll go over later in this session. And then there's another control called flip view, which for those of you who went to Joe Stegman's session early in the morning, he showed the flip view control there. In the remaining 50 minutes or so, we'd go over all of these controls and look at the different capabilities and look at some code as well. But before we move on, I wanted to make sure that all of us here understand and are aware of the fact that your XAML knowledge transfers over to Windows 8 as is. XAML remains XAML. So specifically talking about the control model aspects, all the control concepts like control templating, control styling, the parts and states model, the VSM, Visual State Manager stuff, data binding, data templating, collection view source, and collection view. All of those concepts, among others, come as is to Windows. So, when you're building applications, hopefully it's going to be really familiar to you, the whole concept. Excuse me. So the first control in our list is called list view. And it's a control that displays a collection of items where each item is stacked vertically. It's really good for scenarios like media playlist or any kind of other playlist where you need some kind of ordering. If you have an application that is a retail application, a wish list comes to mind for people. Any master details scenario where you have master list and does not have a lot of data, a lot of rich visualization for each individual items, that also forms a good scenario for list view. And lastly, but not the least, search results is a very common scenario for list view as well. So let's go ahead and take a quick coding demo on what it takes to build an application using list view. All right, so here I have an application. And who knows about Snap View by this point? Snap View? All right, some people. So I'll go over that real quick when I'm demoing this. But the purpose of this demo right here is I have a collection of images, and I want to use in the Snap View, I want to show those images in a list format. And right now I've set this up using a list box, which is a control that most of you should be familiar with. And I'll run this code and show what it looks like. But before I do that, I wanted to quickly go over some of the properties in here for those of you who are not familiar with XAML. So the most important property on a list control in general, and list box specifically, is a property called item source. This property defines what data to display inside this list box. And over here, I have used data binding to provide data to it. In this session, I will not go over data concepts a lot. There's a session tomorrow by Lawrence Maroney, and that will cover data. And so I'd encourage you to go there to understand some of the data concepts. I've set selection mode to single. That means I'll have only one item selected at a time. And I'm going to start off by this item not being shown. So this list box is not going to show initially. And that's by design, that's on purpose, because when the app goes into Snap View, this app detects that it's in a Snap View, and at that point, it will turn on the visibility of list box to be visible, and list box would be shown. And again, in this session, I'm not going to cover the details of Snap View, the coding details of Snap View. I believe there's a session by Tim Hewer on Friday on that. It's either tomorrow or Friday. And the next most important property in here is a property called item template. Item template is a way of providing how each item within that list box is visualized. And it takes a data template, and you have any arbitrary XAML in there. In this case, I have an image and a text block. So each of my data item will be represented by an image and a text box. So let's run this application real quick. Ken, is this displaying fine? Awesome. Should work now. So over here, this is my normal view of the application. I have a bunch of images that's showing up. To get to the Snap View, I will do this. There you go. So my application now is in Snap View, and you can see how this is a list of items being shown, and it is using a list box which supports single selection here. So now let's see what it takes to update this to use a list view. And all I'm going to do here is change list box to list view. So instead of typing 7 words, you got to type 8 words, or 8 alphabets, I guess. So I could run this right now, and you would see that list view is showing up. But I want to add a little bit more functionality here before I move on. And one of the things that I wanted to do is instead of selection, I actually want to show details of the image instead of just selecting an image. And that's a new interaction model that we're introducing in list view for Windows 8. So let's go ahead and do that and see what all it takes to make that happen. So I've added one property here called isItemClickEnabled. That means when each item is pressed, I want to get a click event. And the next thing here is I've hooked up a click event, and this click handler will be called. Since I want a press behavior which is analogous to click, I'm going to turn off selection mode. So I'm going to turn selection mode to none. Let's go ahead and write some code for our results view. And when an item is clicked, I'm simply navigating to another page with the correct context. And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail of navigation. Marco covered that earlier in the day today, so you could go reference his session. So now you see that I have a list view, which looks better and more metro style than a list box. And if I go ahead and click on an item, instead of getting selection behavior, I'm actually showing more details. And this is how you can make an app which is use another new selection model. So let's going back to the slides. So what you saw was the learning curve from using list view is exactly 0. Because all your APIs come as is, all the concepts come along. The new thing here is the interaction model, which means that when you have an item that you want to click, and as a result of that, you want to show an entirely different piece of UI. And I showed you in the context of a snap here, just because that was convenient for this example. But this is relevant anywhere. In your normal view, you can do this as well. When you want to show more details in a totally different UI, this is another interaction model to go use that. So now what I wanted to call out here is selection modes that existed in listbox are supported in list view. That means you have single selection, multiple selection, extended selection, and all of those. And this is the clicking behavior is a little bit new. So when you're building applications, I'd encourage you to consider what's the best user experience for your customers, and based on that, use these 3 APIs that let you choose which interaction model you want. So the first demo I showed you, the pick stream, I showed you a bunch of items in a collection, and I panned, and it smoothly panned in it. And maybe that collection had like 100 items or 200 items, and that worked fairly well. But what happens when you have a collection that has a really large number of items? And by large, I mean thousands of items. So typically, today's experience is around, the end user gets a little bit jarring experience. Either in some instances, the UI appears to freeze for a little bit while data is downloaded in chunks, or the user experience is designed around paging, which is a decent user experience, but the user has to go press on different page numbers or next items, and that's how you get to more items. So list view inherently now supports data virtualization, which provides a responsive, fast, and fluid user experience for large collections. So this is best displayed using a demo. So I'm just going to switch back to my demo machine. All right. So this is not a coding demo. I'm just going to show the application. Excuse me. So I have an application here. This uses list view. And you can see I have a list view item and master and details here. There are 2 modes of data virtualization, the first one we're going to cover is called random access or classic virtualization, for lack of a better word. And you can see that my list view is bound to a data source that supports data virtualization. In this example, the data source has 1 million items. That's a lot of items. It's not 100 or it's not thousands. It's like 1 million items in this data source. Now look what happens when I'm going to pan this. And it's best demoed using a mouse. So what I'm going to do is to scroll to the middle of the list view and see what happens. So for a collection of 1 million items, you can now provide a fast and fluid experience for your users. And it could be, I'm kind of exaggerating here, 1 million items, but 10,000 items or thousands of items is pretty common. So that's the experience you can get with list view right now. Let's go over some of the finer points here. I'm going to pan up or down and see and just notice closely what happens here. All right. This froze. So you can see as I pan, the first thing you're seeing here is a gray rectangle and some UI. So what happens is when list view is panning, list view tells the data source and requests, I want data from index X to index Y. And the data source says, all right, it's going to connect to the internet and download it. During that time, list view displays placeholder UI. And as data is downloaded, list view will update the placeholder UI with the real data to provide a really fluid experience for your users. And for advanced scenarios, there are ways for you to go ahead and customize the placeholder UI as well. Moving on to the other form of data virtualization. So what we talked about earlier in random access is the end user can access any index of the data item at any point. And the data is downloaded, sparsely if you look at the entire set. In incremental loading, data is downloaded in a sequential manner. And over here, you'll see that I have, again, a list view. It's the same control, same master details kind of application there. And it's bound to a data source which supports incremental loading data virtualization. In this case, this data source has 20 items, and that means it has 20 items on the client. On the server, it may have another hundreds and thousands of items. So the best way to look at this is as I pan this down, take a look at the panning indicator. Is that visible from far back? Can you guys look at the panning indicator? Right there? OK. So as I scroll down, you see that it jumped back up. And the count raised from 20 to 32. Let me do that again. It went up to 44. So what's happening is list view is detecting that it's nearing the end. And since the data source supports incremental data virtualization, it asks for additional data and downloads specific data based on, it's downloading, I think, 3 pages of data right there. And it downloads that set of data so that it can display that. Again, this experience is similar to the paging experience that you're familiar with. And you come across this on wall posts, on social websites and whatnot, where the user ends up going to the end to download more data. So that's new for data virtualization. Let's go back to our slides and take a quick look at some of the APIs around data virtualization. First of all, the random access or the classic data virtualization, the thing that the data source needs to implement is a new interface in XAML called iVirtualizing Vector. And that's it. On the list view side, on the control side, there's nothing new that needs to happen. For incremental loading, there's another interface called iIncremental Loading Vector that the data source has to implement. Now, I'm not going to go into details of these interfaces. That's going to be covered in Lawrence's session tomorrow. So I'd encourage you to go there if you're interested in finding more details about it. However, I do want to go over some of the control properties around data virtualization. The first thing is we have provided you the ability to control or to tweak how much data is downloaded in one request. So when I reach the end of the list view in my incremental loading example, we downloaded 12 items. And that's based on the data fetch size property that's new on list view. It's in the unit for data fetch size is pages. So you can, by default, it's I think 3 to 4 pages or something like that. So you can go tweak that if you want to download 5 pages or 10 pages of data in one go, or maybe just 1 page of data, depending on how rich your data is and other constraints. So that's one. And I want to call out here that data fetch size is actually pertinent to both incremental loading and random access. Both of them, you can go on how much data is downloaded. The second thing I want to cover here is, and this is relevant only for incremental loading, is the fact that you can control when incremental loading is triggered. In our example, you saw that as list view reached the end, it automatically downloaded additional data items. Excuse me. So it automatically downloaded additional data items. But in certain examples, you can control it so that you programmatically invoke incremental loading. And that's actually pretty common, again, on social websites where when you reach the end, there's a button there saying download more wall posts. So you can build experiences like that by using the incremental loading trigger property. And there are 2 other properties on there, which is kind of for advanced scenarios. And if you're interested, please find me afterwards, and I'll go in more details of those later. So all the functionality that you just saw around touch support, animations, the new interaction model, data virtualization, both forms of data virtualization, all of that is supported in list view, and it is also supported in grid view. So you get all of what we talked about up until now comes along in grid view as well. Plus, grid view provides you for a way to simply display items in a grid. So this is useful really for scenarios where for each of your data item, you want to have a fairly rich data visualization, which takes a little bit more space. So for a photo album or a photo viewer like this, it makes more sense to put it in a grid view rather than a list view, because list view you'll have only 1 photos and you'll be going vertically with all this real estate. Grid view is useful. So grid view is useful for scenarios like that. Another great example is a movie app. So if you have a movie store, you have a movie or product catalog, and in there every movie item would have maybe a small trailer, a rating, a title, the stars, and all of that stuff. And that takes a little bit more space, and it's really relevant with grid view to build those kind of scenarios. When you use grid view out of the box, you get this kind of layout, and you do not have to do anything new to it. So the APIs we saw in list view, all of the same APIs work with grid view, and when it lays out, it will show you items in a grid. That's it. But there are certain scenarios where you actually want to draw your customer's attention towards a certain data item in your collection. Think about scenarios like a newsreader application, where maybe you want to draw their attention to the top news of the hour. And for that, you want that news article to be larger than other items. Or, vice versa, if there's something which is not as important, it becomes smaller. Another great example there is if you are an online retailer, items that are on sale, you may want to draw users' attention to them. Or maybe items that you make the most profit on, you want them to be the largest so that people go ahead and buy more of those, things like that. So for that, we've introduced a new panel called variable size wrap grid. I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with the panel concept in XAML. I am seeing some heads, so good. So variable size wrap grid is a new panel, and you can tell the grid view to use this new panel to lay out your items if you so desire. Since the code for grid view is just as similar as list view, so I'm not going to go into coding examples for this yet. Excuse me. So grid view in Windows 8 also supports grouping. Now, grouping of data is actually pretty common in a lot of scenarios out there. Think about the movie app that we just talked about, or the movie store applications. If you have a movie store where you have movie catalogs, it makes sense to group them by genres. You know, so you have a group for comedy, a group for science fiction, a group for adventure, you know, and so on and so forth. Similarly, grouping by ratings or grouping by release date or things like that. If you are in a contacts application where, you know, most of the contacts are grouped by alphabets, the Windows 8 apps search area groups applications again by alphabets here. You must have seen that on your devices. And over here, I have another example of, you know, fictitious application which is mimicking an ice cream shop. And over here, and I have menu items that are grouped by different categories like ice cream, gelato, and frozen yogurt. So consider using grouping with grid view when you have data that makes sense to be logically grouped. It actually provides for a nicer and easier user experience for your end users. So now that we understand what, you know, grouping is conceptually and what it looks like, let's go ahead and see what does it take to build a UI like this. This is a very simple grouping example, but this forms the basics of grouping. So what we're going to do is to dissect a little bit of the UI here in slides, and then we're going to go build an application that actually does that. So the first thing here is you have to think about how do you want to visualize each data item across your groups. So all the data items that are there, and this is, again, for most of you in the crowd, this is not going to be new. You're familiar with the item template property on listbox and on items control, and that same property governs how each of the data items are visualized. Again, this can be as rich as you like because it's a data template. The next one here really talks about how do you visualize the group headers. And again, there is a property. This is a new property that we've introduced on group style, and it's called header template. For anybody familiar with WPF here? Have you guys used grouping in WPF? All right, so this will sound familiar to you. Header template property, again, this is of type data template, so it can be as rich as you like. In our case, we've taken the simplest example here by just using a text block. Once you have these two figured out, the next step is to figure out how do you want to lay out items within a group. So in this example, my group ice cream, I have 3 items in there. How do I want to lay them out? In this case, it seems like they're vertically stacked, and that is governed by a property called panel on group style. And you know, you can use any panel in here and control the layout. The last thing I wanted to go over here is the layout of groups with respect to one another. So right now we have 3 groups here, and they appear horizontally right next to one another. And that is governed by a property called items panel on grid view. Again, this property is not new, but this property, when you have grouping data, groups defines how each group is laid out. So let's move on to a coding demo and see what it takes to build an application like this. And this is going to be hopefully pretty quick. All right. So how many of you have actually had a chance to go download the SDK samples? Nobody. One person. All right, so if you've looked at the samples, what I'm doing here is actually going over some of the sample code, so you can download it later and play around with it. And so over here, I have a grid view. And you would notice, just to reinforce, that it has the same item source property. This item source property has a binding that defines the data source. Now, there's something special about this data source because this data source has to support grouping. So I have a slide later on where we'll talk about that briefly. So for now, just assume that this data source supports grouping and it's using binding to get that in. The next property here is the item template property. Again, this is familiar to everybody here, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. And this is my visualization for each menu item in there in my application. So you can see I have an image and a text block that's bound to the what is it bound to? Bound to the title of that ice cream flavor. And that's all I have thus far. And this grid view ends here. So let's go ahead and run this. And you can see that I have all the items that are there. These are flavors for my ice cream shop. And they appear in a grid view, in grid format. And you see that despite the fact that I have a grouping data source, since I have done nothing new in the UI yet, none of the groups show up. So let's go ahead and add the grouping aspects in my code so that we can see some groups. So the first thing I'm going to do is to bring in the header template property. Again, this is the property that defines the visualization for each of my group headers. And you can see that this lives in a type called group style. And on grid view, we've introduced a new property called group style property as well. So you define the group style property, you give it a group style object, and inside there, you're defining the header template property. Header template is of type data template, so it's the exact same thing that you used to when you use item template. And in there, I just have a text block, which is bound to the name of the group. So this defines my group headers. Next, as we talked about, I want to define how each item within a group is laid out. So I'm going to drag in a panel property for the group style. And this group style .panel property, I'm setting this to be a variable size wrap grid. There are two things here. One is if I have more than 3 items in a group, I want that to be wrapped to the next column. That's why I'm using a wrap grid. And variable size wrap grid can be used to actually display fixed size items as well. So hence I'm using that here. So the last thing I want to add here is define how groups within how groups are laid out with respect to one another. And we want, all right, I made a mistake here. Drag and drop error. It's 5 o'clock, man, I'm tired. All right, so the items panel property here defines how groups will be laid out, and we're simply using a stack panel with orientation set to horizontal. That means all my groups are going to appear side by side. So let's build this, and hopefully I've not messed up something. Awesome. So there you go. So you see, it was really straightforward. Once you have the grouping data source, it was really straightforward to get it going on the UI side of things. I have a group header, which is a simple item. I have a bunch of items, and this is using a wrap grid right here. Because I have 6 items, this is wrapping to the next column. And each group is using a stack panel so that it's each group appears horizontally right next to one another. So that was my grouping demo. Let's go back to PowerPoint. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the grouping APIs. The first thing here is, I kind of hand waved over the data side of grouping, and I'm going to talk a little bit more, but still hand wave over it and point you to another session. So conceptually, when we think about grouping, your data source is supposed to be a list of lists. In this case, the higher level list is a list of groups, and it has a name of a group, and it has another list within it which defines the items that belong in that group. So in XAML, to do that, you have to provide a list of iGroupInfo objects. And iGroupInfo is a new interface in XAML, and this provides a key property on it, and it is an enumerable. So hand wave. If you want more details for this, please go to Lawrence's session. I believe it's tomorrow on data. On the UI side of things, the new property here is actually the group style property, and that's it. We talked about items panel and we talked about item template. Those two already exist on list view. So the new property that we've added support for is group style, and group style has a bunch of properties. We went over 2 today, but if you go look at the in Visual Studio, you'll see there are a few other advanced properties in there that you can go use. Now, the last thing there is for advanced scenarios. Who here is familiar with style selectors from WPF? All right, so there are a few folks here. So what the last thing actually supports here is you can pick different group styles for various group in your applications. You can say, group 1, I want you to look X in a certain fashion, and group B looks a little bit different. And if you have a scenario like that, that's where you use a group style selector to choose between group styles based on the data you have. So in the keynote yesterday and in Jensen Harris's talk around the big picture talk around UX of Windows 8, semantic zoom was introduced. And it's really a way to provide users an easier user experience when they're dealing with large amounts of data. So imagine when a data collection has tons of data so that you have to pan, and maybe you have to pan like 15 times to get to the data you want. And that's actually cumbersome. When you're using a mouse, it's easy because you can just scroll to the center and get to the center. But imagine in that data in a large collection, if you have to pan 10 or 15 times to get to the item you want, it's kind of cumbersome. And semantic zoom is a paradigm that helps make that easy for end users. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at a demo in here. This is again all right, so I'm going to go into my app search. And you see that I have a bunch of apps installed on this device. So let's say I want to go to the Socialite app, which is the social Facebook application. And I'm up here, and as an end user, I'm like going through my list of applications, trying to find where the Socialite app is. At this point, I have had to consume a lot of data that's in front of me, and my eyes are like going through searching for it. Instead, if I was in here and I take the pinch gesture and pinch it, I get a higher level view of my data. So this is a higher level view of the entire data set. And over here, it's easier for me as an end user to go to the group S, and that brings the items in the S group into view, and I can go ahead and find the Socialite app right there. So semantic zoom helps with 2 things. One is it provides an easier way for your end users to navigate large collections of data. And secondly, it provides a higher level view of your data, which is semantically different. So in my movie store example, you could have a semantic view where you had groups ratings, groups, all the groups by genres, groups by ratings, and I can go as an end user and pick what vector I want to go look at the data at. So how many of you have actually played with semantic zoom thus far? One person. So then I'm going to show it again just to make sure that everybody is on the same page here. So I press on G, you see how the group G is brought into view for me automatically, even though I was somewhere else. Again, if I'm at the end here, around in my collection, if I go press D, D is brought into the view for it. For XAML, semantic zoom is enabled by a new control called a jump viewer control. And there are two properties that are most important on this control. The first one is what we call the content view. And this corresponds to the view that is, what I'll call the normal view. This is the view you're used to if you have tons of data. This is, in our example, all the apps that show up. The one thing to note here is that it's recommended that you display the entire data set here because there are just two levels in here, and the content view defines the view which has the entire data set. And the other property is called the jump view property, and jump view property corresponds to the higher level look of your data. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to point out here. One is, our recommendation is that for both of these views, you use the grid view control that we just talked about. And that's because there are some subtle things that goes on behind the scenes when you transition from one view to the other. And these includes focus management when you're going from back and forth. This includes mapping which data item belongs in which group and vice versa, and scrolling the right item into view. And doing all of that, if you use grid view for both your content view and your jump view, you get it for free. Now, I realize that there are scenarios out there where you want a different custom UI. And that's also possible to do using another interface called iJumpViewerInfo. And I'm not going to go in detail, or I'm not going to cover that in this session. But if you have questions and if you have advanced scenarios on that, please find me afterwards, and I can tell you some more details on that. So this brings us to our last demo, and we're doing well on time, so that's good. I think you guys might be able to get out of here a little bit quicker. Doc. So this is the Pickstream app. This is what we saw earlier a little bit. So flip view is a control. So all the controls that we just saw, they're collection controls, and they display multiple items at a time. And then you can scroll and do stuff. Flip view displays a single item at a time, but it is still a collection control. And it's awesome for scenarios like photo viewing. So when I go press on that, I get to another page, and this page actually shows me that photo and some details of that photo. This page is built using a flip view. So you can see the touch visualization there. And as I am flipping through items, you can see how this has the right inertia, the right animations, the right Windows 8 personality for you. So this is a quick demo. This is pretty straightforward here. Let me go back to my PowerPoint. So the thing I'm going to call out here is I will not show any code on here because it's not different. It's the same code. If you take the initial code we saw around list view, if you take that, replace that with flip view, everything will work for you. So moving on. So in this session, we covered a lot of concepts, a lot of things around what does it mean to have a Windows 8 collection experience, what are the new control set, how to use them. So some of the key takeaways that would be great for us to have is by using grid view and list view to display collection items, you would get the Metro style user experience for free. This is something that your end users will get used to and will start expecting. So it's something that we encourage you to use as much as possible. For data scenarios that make sense, please consider using the grouping support and semantic zoom support, as it makes for a much simpler and easier user experience for your end users. And the third point there is actually kind of a important point in the sense that it does not seem very important, and I've seen a bunch of XAML developers on our team not pay attention to it. So I wanted to call out here is that the new interaction model that we discussed earlier, when you're building scenarios, think about what makes sense. Does single selection make sense? Multiple selection make sense? Do you want to have the user click on an item and display an entirely different UI? And if you do go ahead and use the new APIs we have provided instead of using the selection APIs, because the UI is different for both. So I'd encourage you to play around with those APIs and see what makes sense. And lastly, and not least, leverage the XAML expertise. Everything you just saw, I think there were a lot of XAML people in here. I think most of it is just the same concepts, new controls, a little bit new add-on stuff. But a lot of this is the same concepts. So your learning curve is going to be really, really small, hopefully. So in that sense, we look forward actually to you building Metro-style applications and providing us with feedback, because we'd love to have your feedback and utilize that in our development going on. Some of the sessions I wanted to call out is tomorrow morning, Alnur is going to do a session on touch and how to build touch applications, touch Metro-style applications using XAML. And then Lawrence Moroney has a session tomorrow on building data-driven collections using XAML, and some of the data aspects that I missed out on today that I did not cover: data binding, data templating, end-to-end network calls, and some of the grouping and virtualization interfaces would be covered in there. Earlier today, Joe Stegman went over XAML overview, end-to-end, what's new in XAML in the context of Windows 8, and what are all the things you need to be aware of. So that's a good session. If you missed that session, it's recorded, just a friendly reminder, so you can always go ahead and view it later on. And then there are a few other sessions that I'm not going to go through all of these. And this is just housekeeping, giving you a list of all the XAML sessions and related sessions. So in the end, I thank you all for being here. I know it's 5 p.m. It's really difficult. Everybody's tired. So I really appreciate all of you here. I will be available for one-on-one questions right afterwards. And over the next 2 days, I'll be splitting my time between the booth and some XAML sessions. So please feel free to come by, ask questions, whatever. Thank you very much.